Hello, everyone. So today, the probe is elated that we have been given the privilege to speak with Professor Vinay Lal, an eminent historian who teaches at UCLA, whose works cover a wide range of fields from modern Indian historiography to cultural history, the sort of politics behind history writing, and so on and so forth. And so we'll be discussing the idea of India. That's the theme that we have kept in mind, but also allied fields and how this idea was historically constructed and understood and contested as well in the social sciences, but also in the public domain. So to start off on a slightly informal note, Professor Lal, your upbringing was rather cosmopolitan in the truest sense. You were raised not only in India, but also in several other countries: Indonesia, Japan, and the United States. So, how did this shape your idea of India in those days? And could you contrast your idea of India back then, uh, with the dominant zeitgeist of those times, how it was dominantly perceived in those times, and the other views that you encountered back then among your peers and among your elders?
Okay, so let me begin by saying that, look, as you mentioned, I mean, I grew up in several countries, but my recollection of those years spent in places such as Tokyo and Jakarta is really on the dim side. Okay, because I mean, I'm speaking about the 1960s. In the case of Tokyo, my father was in the Indian Foreign Service, which is how I landed up in these places. But he was not in IFS-A. He was in IFS-B, which is the lower grade of IFS, which is quite significant, but that's a different story because most people think of the Indian Foreign Service as, a bit glamorized. It's very small. The diplomatic service of India diplomatic corps is much smaller than any other country, even countries that are much smaller than India. But IFSB is a different proposition. Now, so I can't really speak about how I was thinking of India when I was in Japan or when I was in Indonesia, really, because I was a very young boy. I was in Indonesia from 72 to 74. Um, but I do have some recollection, which does not speak directly to your question, but in a way, these things lingered on and become part of who one is. And they must have subliminally have had some effect on me. And the clearest recollection I have, which has, as I said, a very tangential relationship, but nonetheless one, to the question you asked, and that is that uh, sometime in 72 or 73, uh, there were anti-Indian riots that took place in Jakarta. And since my father was in the diplomatic service, the children, Indian families who had children, their children were taken to school on a police escort. Okay, and I have a dim recollection of asking myself what accounted for these riots. Why were they anti-Indian riots? I don't recall what my father, because I asked that question, posed it to my father, but I have no recollection of what he told me then. Now, why is that a segue into your question? Because often how one thinks of oneself, how one thinks of one's own country, has to do with the subject position that one is occupying. Okay, and you look also, and secondly, you look differently at yourself and the country which is part of your imaginary if you're looking at it from the vantage point of some other place. All right, so um, let me give you another, since you had started on that informal note, let me give you another anecdote here now, and now we're going to get closer to the gist of your question. And that is that uh, when I was growing up in India, so you know how the foreign service works. You live abroad for a couple of years and you come back for a couple of years, then you go again, and another posting. My father had another posting, then we came back again. And the school I went to here, every time I came back, was Springdale School, which is in Delhi, on the main school, which is on Pusa Road. That was the home institution, as it were. Now, around 14 or 15, uh, I'm talking about the time really of the emergency, almost in 1976. At that time, I was here in India. I left for the United States in October 1976, but the emergency was earlier. And I remember thinking to myself, yeah, there's a national. So this is not about the emergency. This is just that's just a reference period to, because I recall the time when this I was thinking of this particular anecdote, namely that think to myself, um, there's a national holiday on October 2nd, which is Gandhi Jayanti. And as you know, there are really three major national holidays here. Um, there are lots of guested holidays, but the three are Republic Day, Independence Day, and Gandhi's birthday, Gandhi Jayanti. I think to myself, why is there a holiday for this, what Churchill called half naked old fakir, right? I mean, because I have to say that my recollection is that no one really knew what Gandhi stood for among my peers in school. What we knew of Gandhi was what we had read in the history books, in the school textbook, that he was a father of the nation, he had led a nonviolent struggle. But there was this supposition, and remember, I mean, I'm speaking about Delhi, and what is Delhi? It's a city where the Punjabis constitute not just a significant portion of the culture. Of course, there are Indians from all over now, but in some ways, it's a Punjabi city, right? And Punjab has a very different relationship to Gandhi, because in the circles that I know of, I'm not speaking about my intellectual circles developed over the course of the last 3 4 decades. I'm talking about families that we knew from childhood, including relatives. There was complete disdain for Gandhi, which continues to the present day. I can't even tell you some of the words of abuse that are used, okay, by some people who are relatives of mine. I mean, I'm absolutely, utterly ashamed, you know, that they use these words, but they do. Okay, and the school that I went to was again a school where it was largely Punjabis. Okay, Springdale School, and uh, I don't remember that anyone ever spoke of Gandhi with any kind of respect. So there was this question about, so why are we celebrating this man? And he doesn't even dress properly. That's the way that people thought, so to speak. Okay. Now, when I went to the US in October 1976, some months after that, I read Gandhi's autobiography. Okay. Um, and I know from my pencil annotations, which I still have that copy, I know from my pencil annotations when I read it and what I was thinking at that time. Right. And I haven't been able to explain to myself exactly what it is that led to some kind of transformation within me, because I do know this, that I read that autobiography and life has never been the same since then. It has never been the same since then because, of course, uh, gradually one became aware of the world historical importance of this person and the sheer majesty of the accomplishments, if you want to put it that way. Accomplishments is a rather poor word. This is not like objective careers and accomplishments. The man is made of a different, he's cast in a different mold in a way. And this now I can give you variations of this, okay, anecdote, so to speak, about Gandhi, which will speak directly to your question. I'll just end with one small account of it. So about 15 20 years ago, I was talking to a wealthy Indian American because I have an interest in Indian Americans as well. In the diaspora community, I wrote a book called The Other Indians, and so I was speaking to this gentleman. He's quite wealthy. He was one of the Indians who came to the United States uh, uh, before 1965. So between 1947 and 65, it's important to underscore the fact that Indians were banned from the United States. They were not the only group who were banned. They were what were called the Asian exclusion laws from 1923 to 1945, and Indians, Chinese, Japanese, various other people were banned from the United States. After the end of the war, World War II, 100 Indians were permitted every year until 1965. There were some people who were admitted beyond that quota for various other reasons, but it was very restricted immigration. Now he came during that period, and what he told me was, so I asked him, what was it like? Did you encounter racism, discrimination? He said, all I had to do was say I'm from the land of Gandhi, and the doors would open for me. The doors would open for me. And yet, this man himself is a Kattar Hindutva. Okay, so I want to underscore that. Okay, I want to underscore that. And the people that he consorts with, they absolutely loathe Gandhi. These are all Gujaratis that I'm speaking of in Los Angeles. Okay, yet he admits what the very name of Gandhi meant if you were an Indian in the United States, you see, right? So to go directly to your question, how one thinks of India when one is abroad, okay, uh, and recall that Gandhi himself came to an awareness of India from 21 years in South Africa. Obviously the 3 years in London he spent as a student studying law, but then he comes back to India for a short period of time for 1 year, finds that he's not able to make the kind of living he wants to make, and the courts are corrupt and everything. And so he gets an opportunity which he takes up to go to South Africa. And how he thought of India and what his conception of India was, all of that it really gets shaped in many ways by his time in South Africa. Uh, so if I continued in that vein, one could say a whole lot about what is that what one thinks of a place and how one imagines, in this case, India, certainly has much to do with where one is located, how one locates oneself, and where one is located is of course not simply a question of place of geography. It's a place of intellectual geography. It's the topography of your ideas that really are critically important in shaping a conception of what constitutes India, right? So this is, a very informal way of speaking to the question you had posed.
Thank you, sir, for such an intricate response to what started off as an informal question. There are several themes in that response that we will pursue subsequently during the course of our conversation. Um, I want to bring up the idea at this juncture. I want to bring up the idea of civilization, the construct of civilization, which, at least to my mind, has occupied a central role in the historical scholarship of India, right from the colonial era scholars who had a Hindu civilization or a Muslim civilization, some secular opposition to it from some of the nationalists, if not all of the nationalists, but also Marxists like Didi Kosambi, who use the terms like, okay, the history of India in an outline. So the centrality of India as a civilization was throughout all of their scholarships, and they talked about a civilization. Kosambi talked about a living prehistory, and the term India was a very central place before regional studies actually took over.
Yeah.
How do you assess uh, the validity of this construct of a civilization. Is it really a valid construct that underlies the Indian past, or is it an oversimplification?
No, I think, in fact, actually, the idea of a civilization is critically important in thinking of India. Now, there are hazards and perils, some of which I will suggest in the course of my brief remarks and reflections on this idea of a civilization. Um, we can think of a number of ways to approach this. Okay, uh, let me begin by first suggesting that we may want to distinguish between civilization and nation state. And in fact, the tension between the two has been central to my way of thinking about India. About 20 years ago, 2 decades ago, I published a book with a rather whimsical title. Uh, it's called Of Cricket, Guinness and Gandhi, essays on Indian history and culture. And there are 8 essays in that book. And essentially what that book is about is it's really about this tension between India as a nation state and India as a civilization. And my suggestion there, argument there, which I think is even more germane today, 20 years later than it was then, is that how we resolve this tension between these two ideas, the idea of India as a nation state and the idea of a civilization, will be critically important to how we evolve as a people. Okay, so now let's look at it piecemeal. Again, in an informal kind of way, because obviously the question of civilization is a question on which lots of people have lavished attention, over the years. And you may recall, or some of the listeners may recall, that there is a book by Ananda Kumaraswamy called "What is a Civilization?" Some of you may also recall that in his uh, 1909 tract in Swaraj, Gandhi had some rather caustic remarks about civilization, right? Which is not to say that he was a proponent of the nation state, but those caustic remarks provide a nice entrance point into some of the things I want to say, because uh, let's think of the cognate words. So let's first think of the perils of using that word and why some people have been wary of it. Okay, and one of those cognate words, a different grammatical form, is to civilize, right? Civilization, to civilize. And what was the colonial project, right? One of the central imperatives of the colonial project was that the white people were here and in parts of Africa and elsewhere in the world, purportedly to civilize us, right? That's what, and that's of course why Gandhi had a whole set of caustic remarks. And we know that we are all familiar with the phrase "a civilizing mission," that the European powers, whether it be the British in India or the French in Algeria or the Dutch in Indonesia, etc., they thought of themselves as having been given the task of engaging in a civilizing mission. Now, uh, when we think of a civilization, there are several ways in which we can think of it. One is to think of an assemblage of ideas. Okay, an assemblage of ideas. To think of uh, various ways in which communities were formed and were able to cohere together without the kind of impetus that a nation state provides. What does a nation state do? What is a nation state, right? Nation state is a political entity uh, which demarcates itself as separate from others through boundaries, and these boundaries are then enforced through armies. More recently, when I say more recently, I mean, let's say about 125 years ago, with a document called the passport. And the passport is a relatively recent document in human history. You read John Tory's book, the social history of a passport, and you realize how recent this document is, which is a document without which none of us today can actually cross international borders. People did that all the time. How did they do it? right? So what a nation state is it's a political entity that tries to safeguard its sovereignty, right? And I think nation state and sovereignty go together. Civilizations may have and obviously do have some conception of sovereignty, but that sovereignty is a much more diffused conception, I would say, than it is in the idea of a nation state. So, a nation state is a political entity that is bounded. It's got borders. These borders then have to be safeguarded. The presumption is that the nation state has the authority to safeguard these borders with violence if necessary. Recall what Weber had said, that what distinguishes a state, okay, from other entities. The state claims the only legitimate monopoly on violence, right? Okay, and then these borders are enforced, as I said, not just through armies, violence, but documents such as the passport. Okay, now what kind of world are we living in when we're living in a nation state? So Shudipto Kaviraj, one of India's well-known political theorists and historians, uh, uh, wrote an essay about 20 maybe odd years ago. It's called The Imaginary Institution of India, I think, if I recall correctly the name of the essay. I think it appeared in Subaltern Studies originally, one of the Subaltern Studies volumes. And there he makes a distinction between, I mean, he's not the only person to make such a distinction, but I pick on that because he was speaking specifically to India, and I think the categories that he invokes are useful for thinking about this set of issues here. He invokes a distinction between what he calls fuzzy and bounded. Okay, cat worlds that we live in. So when we, for example, enter into the late 18th century, particularly, and moving into the 19th century, it starts to become a more bounded world, a world of numbers. It becomes an enumerative world. You see, right? So the nation state is very much a political entity which lives with the conception of a bounded world. A civilization, in contrast, is a political entity, cultural entity, an assemblage of ideas which can entertain a kind of fuzziness, or what I, in much of my work, call ambiguity. Ambiguity. Okay. So that's one way in which one begins to think of a civilization. So let's take a couple of illustrations. Uh, we'll take one from India, we'll take one from outside India. Let me begin with the latter. Let me begin with the latter, okay? Because that gets us into a number of other questions. Because I want to reiterate, or rather, I want to suggest at this time that one of the difficulties I have with much of the work done on Indian history, even at its best, is that I think that there is a kind of insularity among historians who work on India, Indian historians working on India. And this is a bit of an aside. I'll get back to that illustration. I want to give you but you'll see why it's important, because I think our discussion is also, in a sense, about historiography. Okay, and it's about how we think about India, and therefore the question is, can we think about India without thinking about other places as well? Our reference point always, when it's not India, is just one, and that reference point is the West. Okay, now the same thing happens in China. If you're I've spoken to dozens of scholars who work on China. I've had Chinese postdoc fellows who have come and worked with me at UCLA. Okay, and the same thing holds true for people in Africa, in Latin America. What is it that holds true? If you're in China, you either know something about China and something about the West. You don't know anything about Latin America, Africa, India. It's just a blank. I mean, I'm not talking about people who are obviously specialists. There are specialists in Indian studies in China, so obviously they know. But I'm just saying, in general, what does an educated Chinese person know? They know about their history, and they know about the history of the West. What does an educated person in Africa know? They know about the history of Africa, or the particular part of Africa they come from, whether it's West Africa or East Africa, and they know about the West, right? And that is the picture all over the world. So now this illustration I'm going to give you is an illustration which doesn't fit squarely into, one region, as it were, a bounded region called the West or India or China. And this is an illustration which is um, drawn from Mark Mazower's lovely book, okay? Salonika. The book is called Salonika. Uh, it refers to the city of Thessalonica, also known as Salonika, in the Greek peninsula. Now, this part of the world came under Nazi occupation, okay, during the Second World War. And when the Nazi commander moves into Salonika, he asks the mayor, okay, and he says, where is the Jewish ghetto? Because the first thing the Nazis wanted to do, of course, was to separate out the Jews, right, from the non-Jews. Because at this point in time, the plan to exterminate Jews across Europe was already in full swing. All right. So he says, where is the Jewish ghetto? And he's told there is no Jewish ghetto. And the Nazi commander says, but there are lots of Jews here. I know this. And the mayor says, yes, of course, but there's no ghetto. And guess what? This goes back, you'll see why I've picked this anecdote, right? Because of that word that I'm going to use now. The Nazi commander writes back to the Gestapo headquarters in Berlin saying, the people here are completely uncivilized. They don't realize that the Jews have to be isolated. The Jews cannot be permitted to mix with Catholics and Protestants and Muslims, and they're completely uncivilized. It's extraordinary, because of course he's speaking about a people who are so civilized that they can live with that ambiguity, with that ecumenism, with that pluralism. Now that's what a civilization enables you to do, because what Mark Mazower tells you is that if you walked down any street in Salonika, on that same street you would see a Roman Catholic cathedral, you'd see a Protestant church, you'd see a mosque, you'd see a synagogue, all on the same street next to each other. Right? This idea that we can all survive and live together, there is a certain kind of pluralism, only a civilization can make that possible. A nation state finds it very difficult to do that, if you ask me. A modern nation state, now someone might easily, because I think we always, whenever we make such arguments, we have to be able to anticipate the rejoinder, right? So in Indian philosophy, that's the Purva Paksh. That when you have an argument where your argument should contain within it the anticipation and the rejoinder to all possible objections to your argument. And someone might well say, isn't it the case that the modern nation states in Europe, they are wonderful examples of this? Well, there's a huge difference. The difference is that all of this that you find, the kind of so-called pluralism you find in European cities today, in London or Paris or Berlin or Brussels or whatever the case might be, number one, this all came about after massive ethnic cleansing in all of these places. The Europeans were masters of ethnic cleansing, right? And they had, and that's what the Holocaust is. What the Holocaust did was it brought back to the heart of Europe what the Europeans had done to everyone else. What they had done in India, what they had done in Africa, what they had done in other parts of Asia. That's what they did. And of course, now the so-called ecumenism, pluralism you have, this is the kind of multiculturalism that is mandated from the top down. The kind of scenario I'm speaking about, the kind of pluralism that you found in Salonika or that you found in many parts of India, was not mandated from the top. It wasn't a matter of state policy that now we're going to try to accommodate all of these people. This was something that originated from the ground up in many ways, right? So now I think we can begin to see the ways in which we can say that civilization and nation state are very, very different entities, because one of the ways in which we have to certainly, so your question, the basic question was, uh, what is a civilization? So I said a civilization, when you think about it, you have to think about an assemblage of ideas. You think about various kinds of cultures that together constitute that space. They have a relationship that I'm not suggesting that everything is hunky dory in the past. I want to be very clear about that. I'm not suggesting that Salonika may never have been the site of some kinds of conflict. Just as when we speak about the pre colonial past, the supposition should not be that everything was always hunky dory, sab bhai bhai the. No, I'm not suggesting that necessarily. But at the same time, that should not at all lead us to the view that conflict, whether based on religious identity, and we'll have to at some point talk about identity, what that means, and why there's so much agonizing over identity, not just in this country but in almost every place that I can think of now. Uh, because frankly, some of it is just, there's no other word for it. It's actually quite juvenile. I mean, it's extraordinarily juvenile. People who are always, clamoring about identity and so on. At some point, one will have to learn to have a much richer conception of one's life and how to think of oneself. But the, the problem simply here is that when we're looking at this pre colonial past, the supposition should not be uh, either that things were always, as I said, hunky dory. There was an agonistic relationship often between different communities. But the genius of a civilization is that it can accommodate these differences, it can live with it and live with this difference differently. There are different ways of living with difference as well, right? So that's what we'd have to understand from the past of India. That's what we'd have to understand from the pre colonial past of many other places as well, including, incidentally, Europe, because it's not my view that Europe was destined to become a continent that would produce colonial powers. And I've never been comfortable. I hear this all the time. There are some phrases that become just part of the language of everyday life for people unthinkingly. When people say, "Oh, it's in the DNA," it's high, it's in the DNA of such and such person or entity to do this. I don't know about that. I'm never comfortable with the supposition that something's in the DNA. You know, uh, how Europe uh, colonized its own others, is an interesting part of the story, uh, because even within Europe, and here I'm alluding uh, not simply to the colonization of women, the colonization of various groups that get construed as minorities within a country. I'm also speaking about, for example, the divide between Western and Eastern Europe. Right? When did this divide start? Where does Western Europe end, and where does Eastern Europe begin? And Larry Wolff wrote a wonderful book, The Invention of Eastern Europe, where he speaks about how Eastern Europe was underdeveloped, okay, it within Europe, so to speak, right? Right? And that then becomes a template for much of European colonization, of the rest of the world, particularly Africa and Asia. And the Spanish and Portuguese, of course, is a much earlier phase.
Thank you, sir. That was a very enlightening answer. Moving along the same lines, in post-colonial countries, the rhetoric of decolonization is often mobilized to support revivalist projects. Intellectually, some strands aim to reincarnate a pristine pre-colonial framework of thought and ideation. Is decolonialization always reactionary? Can there be a legitimate process to decolonization?
Well, I mean, I'm glad you asked this question because, this is one of those words, decolonization, that has now been completely hijacked by the Hindu right. Uh, so I think first we need to begin with this, that the Hindu right and its various supporters, I will not mention names, not for the sake of prudence, but for the sake of civility. Okay, but there are a number of people purporting to write about this from the point of view of the Hindu right, who write as though they were the first people to think about decolonization. I mean, which is absolute absurdity, absolute absurdity, right? And these are people who get celebrated in book festivals, all over the country, and their books sell, by several thousands or tens of thousands. I mean, it's just extraordinary. So let's go back to uh, uh, the 1940s and 50s, okay? Because what was Aimé Césaire discourse on colonialism? He has a short book, Discourse on Colonialism, first written in French, right? This book is from sometime around the 50s, early 50s, somewhere around that time. I don't remember the exact date. The English translation came out by Monthly Review Press. I've taught the book for many years. What is he talking about? He's talking about decolonization, right? What did he mean by decolonization then? So let's uh, parse this in a few ways. Okay, and I have Césaire in mind. I have in mind someone like Edward Said 3 decades later. I have subaltern studies. I have the work of one of our most interesting thinkers easily, Ashish Nandi, such as his book, The Intimate Enemy, because all of these works really belong to that sphere that we can call decolonization. Okay, but let's first move to a more general level. When people think of decolonization, and when, for example, the Bandung Conference was held um, uh, in 1956, okay, in Indonesia. Uh, what was that conference about? It was a conference of Afro-Asian countries which had decolonized, okay, uh, which had decolonized, and that meant, and that takes us to the first meaning of decolonization. That meant that these countries had, and I don't mean this was true exactly of every country, because China was represented there too. Chow Enlai came there, Nehru was there, uh, and China was not colonized in the way in which India was obviously colonized. But we know that there were European spheres of influence. I mean, think back of the history of the Boxer Rebellion. Think back of the shelling of the Imperial Palace, the first Opium War, the second Opium War in the 19th century, right? It's not necessary for me to enter into the details, simply to convey the fact that when I speak of the Bandung Conference of the countries that were there, the bulk of the countries there were countries that had been under colonial rule directly. Some, such as China, had not been, but nonetheless, they had been colonized in other ways. Okay, now, so the first meaning of decolonization, as it was understood then, and we should not forget that, was countries that essentially it signified countries that had liberated themselves from the yoke of colonial rule. That's what decolonization meant. First, political independence, self determination. The second meaning okay, and the Bantu Conference addresses this at considerable length, right, has to do with a certain degree of economic self-reliance and sovereignty, right? And one could go on in this way. But let's move to the gist of it, because the question that you have posed undoubtedly is posed with respect to the fact that if you're looking at present day India, what is it that the government has been saying for the last 10 years since we're in the third round of the BJP now, or Modi 3.0, but since 2014, what they've been saying is that, you know, and the Prime Minister has been very clear about this from day one, that he's going, that once he came to power, he said, now this is the beginning of the end of 1200 years of slavery, 1200 years. 1200 साल की गुलामी अब खत्म होगी, you know, right? So in other words, we are now finally going to start to decolonize. The Hindu right uh, use of decolonization really is about 10, 15 years old. That's it. You're not really, they haven't engaged with the discourse of decolonization and such before that. Okay. So the heart of the question here has to do with a different conception of decolonization, and that's what I want to speak to now. That takes me now back to where I started 5 minutes ago when you first posed the question. Aimé Césaire. Okay. Discourse on colonialism. Because your question is there a legitimate way to think about decolonization? Right? Is there a way to think about decolonization which makes it truly meaningful uh, uh, for not just some elites there, okay, but for the people as a whole. So therefore we have to think about it, and I'm going to take some time to answer this question because there are a number of critical things involved in thinking about it. Okay, so if you go back to Césaire 1956, what he's really speaking about is a project that has yet to commence. And he says this is the task before us. So this is not now political self-determination. This is not economic sovereignty. What he's talking about is the decolonization of the mind, intellectual decolonization. Okay. For example, the very way in which people had been reduced under a long period of colonial servitude to objects, what he calls thingification. Thingification. Okay. So he's saying that, look, you look at how the particular way in which the European imposed certain frameworks of knowledge. Now, this is a very polemical work, so he doesn't really get into detail. Okay, it's a short polemical work, 50, 60 pages. The particular way in which the European thought about others, okay, how do we distinguish between ourselves and others? What is the relationship that we have to others? The particular ways in which the Europeans imposed a certain kind of hierarchy of power, all right, and the particular ways in which they thought about the landscapes and the people that they colonized. Now, what he's saying here in Discourse on Colonialism is, how do we emancipate ourselves from that? Right? So let's try to understand what exactly decolonization really entailed for a subsequent generation of writers, including, let's say, Edward Said. Orientalism is 1978. Okay, that's when the book was published. The Intimate Enemy, Ashish Nandi's, which is closer to us at home because nearly the bulk of everything he speaks about is India, although the argument can really be stretched to it, I would argue, to any part of the world. Much in the way in which Edward Said in Orientalism doesn't talk much about India, right? But we know that the work became very influential, and of course there were some Indian scholars who were a little wary of that, even within the subaltern school. Somebody like Shumeen Sarkar, for example, was rather wary of the ways in which Saidian frameworks had infused the study of Indian history, and he thought diminished some of the other strands of thinking that he thought were important or should be important. But nevertheless, I think we all know, you're both history students as well, and we all know that if you look at Said's Orientalism, the bulk of the examples that he drew upon were from what is called the Middle East, or what we in India call West Asia, from uh, the Arab world, from the Muslim world, with occasional references to colonization elsewhere, including India, Durkers, and so on. Right now, what is it that, without getting obviously into the question of all the arguments that Said is talking about, that's not fully germane at this point in time for us. What is critically important there is this, okay? And I'm going to translate it into a different language than the language that either Said or Nandi really use. I'm going to draw upon a language which I have elaborated upon considerably in my own work in a book called Empire of Knowledge, Culture and Plurality in the Global Economy, which was published by Pluto Press in 2002. So, over 20 years ago. So, what is that language? And how does it help explain what is decolonization? Fundamentally, the problem is this, that if you look at the world of knowledge, right, you have to essentially look at the particular ways in which the disciplines have carved up the world of knowledge. Okay, and one thing that we should keep in mind, it's just a little aside, but it's important, which is that it has become increasingly the case that the university has become nearly the sole repository of what is called knowledge. That was never the case before. It was never the case 200 years ago. Right? Universities have become increasingly the place which are seen as the authoritative repositories of something called knowledge, and the practitioners of the various disciplines are attached to universities, as am I. Right? So now the disciplines, so let's just look at the social science disciplines, because that's what we're interested in, and some of the humanistic disciplines. So you've got geography, economics, sociology, psychology, anthropology, etc. Right? Now, each of these disciplines purports to offer a certain view of the world, the claim being that it offers a certain perspective which another discipline cannot, and these disciplines supposedly all complement each other. Supposedly, they all complement each other. I often, even in my graduate seminars, I take about half an hour, very often, depending on the nature of the seminar. I say to my students, okay, let's think about geography. Tell me in one word, what does geography deal with? Right? So in undergraduate classes, they'll say things like the world, uh, countries, space. Sometimes they'll say space, okay, or place, right, etc., etc. Right? And so I tell them, yes, the one word, if you had to think about, that deals with geography is space. One word. What does history deal with? Right? And the usual answer I get is the past. And I tell them, no, that's not really the word I'm looking for. One word, right? And different people will give different answers, and then one word, that word is temporality, or time, if you want to put it that way. Temporality. What does anthropology deal with? Right? So let me ask both of you, what does anthropology deal with, you think? If you had to use one word, forget about the article before the word, what does it deal with?
Humans.
Culture.
Okay, what did you say, Pushkar?
Humans.
Humans. Okay. Would it, but history deals with humans, sociology deals with humans, you're close to it. But what is the specific origin of anthropology? When did anthropology begin as a
Uh,
discipline?
is it relationship between humans?
One word. What is the specific origin of the discipline? When did it begin? If you had to do the intellectual history of the disciplines, if you were a student at Cambridge or Oxford in 1500, these universities had already been founded a few hundred years before. There was no such thing as a discipline called anthropology. But were they not thinking about humans already? Of course they were, right? So, what is the specific origin of this?
Culture.
Colonialism.
Acha.
Colonialism, but that's not what it deals with. Anthropology is a specifically colonial discipline. It is born out of colonialism. And what does it deal with? It deals with about some tribe in Polynesia, some village in India, some clan in Africa. The other, they never wrote about themselves. Malinowski, all the great anthropologists wrote about some other. Okay, so that's the discipline deals with the other. That's its fundamental impulse. Okay, now what the point of this is simply to say this. Okay, because I haven't at all forgotten where we started, decolonization. Then saying that look at the world of knowledge. It's carved up between these disciplines. Each of them purports to have a particular sphere. Geography deals with spatiality, history deals with temporality. The past comes within the temporality, but so does the present, so does the future. And that's what we always have to understand, that history is not really just a study of the past. Uh, the idea of studying history is to actually think about the future, if you ask me, and to make us better equipped to think about the present as well. Right? Okay. So to think that history special provenance is the past is incorrect. Its provenance is temporality. That's what its provenance is, strictly speaking, if you ask me. Okay. Now let's go to the next step. That each discipline works through a set of categories. And then there is what I call an imperialism of categories. Okay, each discipline works through a set of categories. So for example, if you are an economist, let's take economics as an illustration. Okay, what is the economist fundamentally interested in? I will tell you, in my view, of course, an economist could come and dispute this completely and say that's rubbish, right? But my view is the economist is fundamentally dealing with something called growth. Growth. No government ever hired an economist. I think, excuse me, no, you will agree with me. No government ever hired an economist so that the economist could tell them how to degrowth the economy. If you know of one, please tell me. I'll be very happy to hear of any such example anywhere in the world. And no economics department ever hired an economics professor so that they could basically instruct the whole department on degrowth, which is what we need right now. We don't need more growth in most parts of the world. We need degrowth, because unless we have some degrowth and unless we are able to decouple ourselves from such things as GNP, etc., GDP, and all of that, unless we are able to decouple ourselves in some ways, at some point, global warming is going to swallow up all of this completely, the rate at which we are actually proceeding. Okay, now the economist is dedicated to this idea. That's a category. That growth is what I call a category. Poverty is a category. Okay, so the economist is fundamentally, when they're thinking about poverty, they're not thinking about the poor, they're thinking about poverty, which is not the same thing, by the way. You know, okay, the two are not the same thing. There are obviously points of convergence. Yeah. Gandhi or someone else, Saint Francis of Assisi, lived a life of poverty. Let's forget about Gandhi, because lots of people don't like Gandhi anymore. So let's forget it. for a moment. Let's take an innocent example. Everyone purportedly loves him. The ones who know anything about him, Saint Francis of Assisi. Yeah. So he lived a life of poverty, but nobody would call him poor. It makes no sense to call him poor. Okay, right? So I'm giving a very simple illustration of how we can distinguish between poverty and the poor. But of course, there are points of convergence in many cases between the two, right? So the economist deals with a certain set of categories through which the economist tries to understand the entire world, right? And of course, the economist, I pick the economist because the economist is more culpable than almost anyone else. I think this is the worst possible discipline you can think about, the most wretched. Okay, and please include this in the interview. Don't edit this out. The most wretched. I mean, there was a reason why it was called the dismal science. Most economists are dismal beyond belief, and the kingmakers highly overrated, if you ask me. Okay, and that's partly because of the nature of the world in which we live, where the whole attempt is to continue to grow our economies for whom, right? So we can have some bloke spending 55,000 crores on his son's marriage, right? That's all an illustration of growth. So what is the relationship between this and decolonization? It's self-evident that decolonization means we have to decolonize the categories through which the academic disciplines have been shaped and through which we try to apprehend the entire world. Right? The fundamental task of decolonization will be to help us try to unravel the categories through which we think about the world. Now, when Ashish Nandi wrote The Intimate Enemy, you see, he was saying that, look, we want to get we want to get the colonizers out of India. But the categories through which they think about the world have become completely intimate to us. We now only apprehend the world through their categories. And this was a singularity of Gandhi, that he was perhaps the only person who was able to think outside these categories and who really followed, in that sense, William Blake's wonderful aphorism: either you create your own system or you be enslaved to another person's. And he created an entire worldview, an entire ecosystem through which he led his life and through which he apprehended the world and through which he attempted to shape a movement, you see, right? But I started with Gandhi. I've just brought him in here occasionally because I've spoken about Gandhi on many, many occasions, written widely on him. I don't want this to be a conversation about him, but I went to The Intimate Enemy because that was one of the things that, if you've read that book, which consists of two brilliant essays, that's all. It's a very short book of about 125 some pages. The gist of the argument really is this: you see that even if you look at all the other major Indian nationalists, in some profound way, barring Gandhi, they were all colonized. Even as they purported to be fighting the colonial state, and even as they purported to be anti colonial figures, they were all profoundly colonized in some ways. Now, the people today in the Hindu right who speak of decolonization, I'm afraid they don't have the foggiest idea what they're really talking about, because these people are completely colonized. Completely. They have no conception of how to think about, for example, let's take one illustration. You're both history students. I teach in a history department. Although let me tell you both, and others as well, that I don't have a single degree in history. Not one. Okay. My PhD is not in history. My bachelor's and master's are not in history. So, but I teach in a history department, and uh, there are certainly people in my department who, and I don't think they think that way now, but they certainly for many years thought, "What is this person doing at this department?" Because the kinds of views he has about how we should think about history are not particularly congenial to most historians. Okay, so let's take the illustration of history. Here we can speak about Gandhi, but due to problems with the network. Are we back? Is the recording going on?
Yes, sir. You're audible now.
I'm audible. Okay, okay. All right. So let's take this illustration. Okay. Um, and actually, the particular illustration, I'll take two illustrations from Bankim Chandra Chatterjee. It's also interesting to take him uh, as a vantage point from which to think about some of these things, because, of course, he's also the author of uh, uh, Vande Mataram, right? Which appears in a novel. Actually, it wasn't written as a separate piece. It appears in a novel, Anandamoth, uh, that he had written in the late 19th century. Now, uh, 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 there's a passage where and Partho Chatterjee, I remember reading this in Partho Chatterjee's book, Nationalist Thought and the Colonial World, something like that. Published about 40 years ago, quite an important work, right? This is where he had talked about nationalism as a derivative discourse. And the illustration he gave was that, Bankim um, had said that, look, an Englishman goes out on a hunt, and uh, as he's gone out for a hunt, he suddenly sneezes. And then he takes a handkerchief out of his pocket and he blows his nose. And then he puts his handkerchief back in his pocket. Okay. And Bankim said, look how much detail we know about this Englishman. He thinks he's so important that when he sneezes, right, he blows his nose and he writes about that, and then he puts his dirty handkerchief back. So he makes a little snide remark about this guy putting the dirty handkerchief back in his pocket, right? Um, and he says, you know, look at us in contrast. We've got these great monuments and a history that is so rich, and we know nothing about it. This rotten Englishman goes on a hunt, and we know the minutest details about them because they record everything. They have a sense of history. And we are pathetic as a people. We have no sense of history at all. You know, our great monuments have languished, and we have no idea about our kings. We just know about Ashoka a little bit, and that's it. You know, or Chandragupta Maurya or something like that. And Bankim then writes a book called Krishna Charitro, the life of Krishna. Right? And what does he say? He says that because he's trying to understand something, he says the question before me is a question before every thinking Indian. Why did we as a people get colonized? And his argument then, in order to explain his argument, what he does is he says in Krishna Charitra, let's look at the life of Krishna. There are essentially two Krishnas in the Indian tradition, he says. There's a Krishna of myth, and there's a Krishna of history. The Krishna of myth is the Krishna outlined in the Bhagavata Puran or Sri Bhagavatam, right? Book 10, which talks about Krishna in Mathura, in Vrindavan, the Ras Leela, and all these episodes from the life of Krishna, some of which, for someone coming from a very Christian tradition, for example, would be very embarrassing because these are episodes in the life of a god, right? Remember, for example, that whole episode, which is called Vastraharan, the theft of the clothes, when Krishna is strolling along the banks of a river, right? He's being the flaneur, if I may put it this way, right? He's strolling along the banks of the river. He sees that the gopis are taking a bath there. And of course, they've gone into the river. They've shed off their clothes. Their clothes are lying in a heap on the banks of a river. So what does he do? He takes these clothes and then he climbs the top of a tree, right? That's the Vastraharan, the theft of the clothes. Now, when the gopis have finished with their bathing in the river and they're just about to come out of the river, they see their clothes are not there. They can't come out because they're naked, right? Now, there's a very rich interpretation about all of this. I won't get into that. Okay, but Krishna says that, look, what kind of God is this? I mean, a God who's, stealing clothes. Or yes, it may be written in a playful way, but this is not, you know, the God of the Allah of Muslims, and this is not the Christian God that we're really speaking about. And he says the problem with us as a people is we became completely enchanted and enamored by these stories. We immersed ourselves in bhakti, and someone just came over and took over our country. But he says there is another Krishna, the Krishna of history, the Krishna of the Mahabharata, the Krishna who counsels the Pandavas and leads them to victory. Of course, what kind of victory it is another question, right? Because at the end of the day, everything is destroyed virtually. And remember that, in the last scene, Yudhishthir and the Pandavas are going to climb up the mountain, and who reaches the very end, etc., right? But let's not get there. We don't have to really entertain the whole story here. The important point simply is this, that Bankim is absolutely, utterly convinced that the problem with us as a people is that we have ignored history. What makes a people rational? What makes a people rational is to have an account, a rational, coherent, historical account of their past. Right? Now, Gandhi took exactly the opposite view. And he said on more than one occasion, it doesn't matter an iota to me whether Krishna ever lived or not, whether Ram was a historical personality or not. In fact, I would go so far as to say this is not his language, it's more my language, that he was firmly of the view that Hinduism was a religion primarily of mythos rather than a religion of history. And he thought that was the singular strength of Hinduism. This is what demarcated this from all other faiths, all other ways of being in the world, really. Okay? He's quite certain in his mind about that. And absolutely no interest in thinking about such things as, these very anodyne phrases that you've heard from, probably the age of 10. You know, the lessons of history. What lessons of history? What a banal phrase. I mean, how many books have been written on the lessons of history, right? Gandhi completely bypasses all of this. Completely bypasses all of this.
Uh,
And different way of living. Are we
the
back?
audio is. So can you say something?
No, yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yes, better. Yeah.
The audio is better. Yeah, yeah, yeah. The connection here may not be
Mm.
great, but I'm sitting as close as I
Mm.
can. Yeah. So now you see, and this is where we get back to the question of decolonization, which is where we started, right? Because what has been, if you look at the last 10 years, right, before the present election, the election that was just recently concluded, and those last 10 years, what was the summation of that? What was the end point? It was a Ram Mandir, okay, inaugurated on January 22nd in Ayodhya. And where did those 10 years begin? They began with something I mentioned a little while ago with the pronouncement by the Prime Minister, right, that now India was going to be delivered from 1200 years of slavery. 1200 साल की गुलामी, right? 1000 years of, Muslim rule, 150 odd years of British rule, and then, of course, the rule of the secularists, right? Right? They all colonized us too because we were not able to live our lives as Hindus, feel pride as Hindus, and all of that. And I'm born into a Hindu family, uh, so he certainly doesn't speak for me. I can tell you that, in having taken that view that he did. But let's think about it. That has been the very prominent note. And I know the question was not asking me about what the Indian left should do, but I have long thought that that was a fundamental problem with the left here and with the human rights activists as well. They cited constantly things like, yeah, the economic data suggests that the country is doing so poorly. How does this guy still, why does the BJP still win? Because frankly, the bulk of the people, particularly Hindus, did feel, partly as a consequence of the claims that have been advanced on behalf of them, they did feel that now they could live for the first time with some sense of pride as Hindus. But this in turn means that they now finally are moving out of a conception of Hinduism as a religion of mythos to a conception of Hinduism which is based on a reading where Ram then becomes an established historical personage. Right? And of course, the whole Ram Janambhuri movement, and beginning with the supposition that there is a Ram Janmastan, that Ram was actually born, that Ram Janmastan, the place where Ram was born, literally. Why? This never interested anybody in India for 2000 years. Nobody had the remotest interest in thinking in that way. And the same holds true for Krishna, right? So, what I'm suggesting here simply is this, that when we're thinking about decolonization, because I'm still speaking around the question that Rijul had asked me about decolonization, giving a very long, elaborate kind of answer through various ways. But fundamentally, we're going to have to think about how the instrumentalization, what today people call the weaponization, that's another word that I don't like, weaponization. But the instrumentalization of history, okay, has become critically important to the Hindu right. And the same people are talking about decolonization, not realizing that this is the most profound way in which we got colonized was when we started to think that history would deliver the answers and that we could then instrumentalize history for certain purposes. You see? You get the gist of what I'm suggesting. So does that answer the question, Rijul, more or less?
Yes, sir. That was a very extensive answer. But yeah, moving on to the next question. In 2005, the Texas-based Vedic Foundation and Hindu Education Foundation were a part of a major controversy where they complained California's curriculum commission that portrayed Indian history and Hinduism in Californian textbook was biased. While the political
Yes.
context of censorship in India would be very different in the United States, it is also constituted that the attempt of a minority community to represent its history. Such nativism is uh, such nativism is also seen where groups have been historically oppressed, are skeptical to the scholarly enterprises, which often feature scholars from historically privileged communities. How do we reconcile these differences?
Okay, so look, I mean, again, it's a question on which I can speak at very great length, partly because I was involved in in this matter. I was among the scholars who wrote in opposition, okay, to foundation that you had mentioned. And I had written a very long open letter which got published in India West. So in California, and the part of the country that you're speaking about is California. So this is in the California, the most important Indian American publication was India West. In New York, it was India Abroad. So different uh, publication there. So India West published us a very long open letter that I'd written on this. So I can speak to this question at great length, but I'm going to try to be brief, okay, because we'll try to just get to the gist of it now. The first thing is this, that uh, uh, the last comment part of your question uh, is the is the uh, is the question on which I think most people will concentrate today. Back then in 2005, that was less the case. What do I mean by that? That you are pointing to, in the last part of your question or your comment, you are pointing to the the upper caste background of many of the scholars or people purporting to be scholars, writing on behalf of the Hindu Education Foundation, complaining that the representation of Hindus in California history textbooks and the representation of India more broadly was inaccurate. So they had objected to it. Uh, uh, this was not emphasized as much, the background of these people, as it would be today, because in the last 5-10 years there has been a very strong anti-caste, anti-Brahminical lobby that has also developed, and of course there's been a backlash to that as well. This the upper caste scholars and the Brahmins, and and their supporters have mobilized too. But I don't like to look at it that way, because I think that uh, uh, it's not a question so much of Brahmins or upper caste people necessarily. I don't think that this is as central to it as I think a number of other questions, okay, to which I'm going to speak about in the broadest way. So the first point is this, that many of the people who were agitating. So what were they agitating about? Let's be very clear so that everyone understands this, because there are some people in India who may not understand fully what is at stake here. That history textbooks, like all textbooks in the state of California, and we're going to just confine ourselves to that state for the okay, they undergo a periodic review. And when they undergo a periodic review, a physics textbook, I think you will appreciate, is not likely to excite any kind of attention. What has been said about the law of gravity is going to remain unchanged over a long period of time. But what is said about Vedic civilization or Hinduism, or you know the Saraswati civilization, etc., etc. All of this changes over a period of time as scholarship changes. Okay, so when a review is done, a periodic review is done, people from the community are invited to submit their comments uh, before the commission, which is authorized to pass these textbooks. Before the commission does that, they will take into account the comments that have been offered by members of the community. So in this case, what is it that members of the Hindu community, and we have to again say some members of some Hindu community, because clearly they're not speaking for everyone, right? And we should never suppose that has always been one of the ploys, the supposition that they speak for all Hindus, which I don't think we should accept, and much as it should never be accepted here in India itself. Okay, so what are some of the things they objected to? One of the things they objected to was that Hinduism was mentioned as being a polytheistic religion. Okay, and they said this it's not a polytheistic religion. Okay, they objected to the fact that women in India were described, in ancient India, were described as having a second class status. Okay, they objected to that. All right. So I'm giving you two illustrations of the kinds of things that they objected to. Right now, let's look at it this way. Okay. First question is, which I've already actually explicitly mentioned, that they claim to be speaking for Hindus. Let's understand who they're speaking for. All right. Number two, it is critically important to understand that very often the same people who are now claiming that, look, we are minorities in America, and therefore people should be attentive to us as a minority. Okay, the same people say absolutely nothing about the status of minorities in India. Nothing. So, Muslims could be getting lynched. A Muslim's house might be raided because of some allegation that their refrigerator has beef in it. I'm not making this up. All of this was happening in the capital city of India, in Delhi, among other places. And you all know of cases where you know people were stopped. They were transporting cattle. You had actually purchased cattle at a fair, and then the person, Muslim, is killed. We know of all these cases. I'm not even mentioning names here because I'm just putting a generic sense so that we don't get fixated on one particular case. Okay. Now, what I'm saying is that we have to understand the nature of minority claims. That's quite important because it's always been, I think, a source of criticism for me, that the people who back in the US, the Hindus among the Indian Americans who are saying, and the Hindu, there's a foundation called the Hindu American Foundation. The Hindu American Foundation was not part of this because it barely existed. I don't even remember when it came into existence, but it was just around this time. And maybe it came into existence as a consequence of this in part. It's been around for 15, 20 years. So it was not really, I don't think, if I recall correctly now, it's been a while now, because I think this all goes back to 2005 or so approximately. Uh, but the Hindu American Foundation, which is a lobby based out of Washington, D.C., okay, and incidentally, they completely want to emulate the Zionists, right? From their point of view, they, they need to learn. Indians need to learn from the state of Israel, and they need to learn from Jewish people how to mobilize. And I'm not going to comment on that, except to simply refer to the obvious, that there's a genocide going on in Gaza right now. So you can evaluate the merit of their observation about emulating Israel and the Israel lobby in the United States. Okay, but they're very adamant about that we need to learn from that. And just look at there's the slightest incident, slightest minute incidents of anti-Semitism or purported anti-Semitism, anti-defamation league, and the US will be on your case immediately. And that's what they want. The Hindu American Foundation, if there's the slightest aspersion about anything having to do with Hinduism, the attention should be focused on that person. Okay. So what I'm saying simply is this: organizations such as these have never said anything fundamentally about the rights of minorities in India itself. They're very keen to claim the democratic privileges that come to them as a minority in America, but let's not worry about minority. In India, it becomes minorityism if you start speaking about minorities from their point of view. Okay, so we should register that. That's part of the politics of what was happening. All right. Now let's look at the specific claims. Let the two illustrations. See, I think there is a problem, but this is not how they understand the problem. There is a problem. If they had expressed it in this way, then I would say there's the beginning of a conversation. Because at the same time, unlike many of my friends, I come from what I call a background where I have learned from Gandhi and had learned from the Jain perspective, okay, which is that there's a many perspectiveness of reality, many sidedness, okay, of reality. Now, let's supposing that they had posed the argument in this way, namely that there is a problem in trying to understand the nature of Indian history through the template of European history. Let's say that they had put it as a general proposition. Then I would say that's the basis of a conversation. Because I think that that is a problem. The very fact that we teach history in this country and in nearly every part of the world, how so? How do we teach it? We carve it up into three segments: ancient, medieval, modern. Right? Well, where did this tripartite division come from? Why is it being applied to India? And remember that the word medieval in Europe was synonymous with another word. What was that? Between the ancients and the moderns, there was something called the Dark Ages. In fact, that was the most commonly used word, the Dark Ages. Okay? Now, simply because it was dark for them, and it was dark for them for various reasons, right, doesn't mean it was dark for us. But this was the supposition. This became the supposition here. The whole Hindutva, the 1200 years, 1200 ki saal ki gulami jo hai, what is it? It goes back to the Muslim, beginning of the Muslim period in India. This was a darkness descended upon us. You see, right? Well, frankly, in fact, it was, you could argue, it was one of the richest periods of our past. One of the richest periods, the whole efflorescence of Bhakti literature. And we're not talking about 4 or 5 major poets, we're talking about 100. If you put their literature together, it is the greatest stash of devotional literature in the world. Right? We're not just talking about Tukaram and Naneshwar and Mirabai and Kabir and Chaundi Das. We're talking literally about 100 major poets almost, at least 30 or 40 who are really of paramount significance. And in each of these languages that we today have, the Bhakti literature played a critical role, even in moving that literature ahead, the language ahead. Okay? And the whole Ganga Jamuna Tehzeeb that people talk about, the Indo-Islamic cultural synthesis that developed, that was again in the so-called medieval period, what was the Dark Ages back in Europe. So see, if the fundamental argument that they were making was that, look, let's not try to understand the Indian past through the European past. Okay, then I would say that's the beginning of a conversation. But no, what are the two examples that I picked on that they pointed out? Okay, that women in India, they argue, had elevated status. Frankly, I think that's completely bogus. Completely bogus. Simply by virtue of the fact that you did have, for example, in the Upanishads, you have at least one woman philosopher, maybe a few. Okay, there's a reference to Gargi and the fact that she constantly poses questions to Yajnavalkya, and poses very interesting and difficult questions, right? To the extent that finally she's told, yeah, stop asking these questions because my head is going to drop off, right? No one is suggesting that women didn't have a role to play in various ways. Okay, but I think the evidence is overwhelming from what we know that women in India, similar to women elsewhere, were in a position of subordination. Right? That's, I think, the gist of the matter, you see, right? And if you take the second, the problem is more acute. See, their objection that Hinduism is being described as a polytheistic religion, the problem here is that this goes back to the question of categories. The problem here is that they want to argue it's a monotheistic religion, which they say. Frankly, I think that's not just intellectually wrong, it's intellectually uninteresting to think of it that way. In other words, these are not the categories through which we thought about. You see, our dharma, okay, thought about our gods. Polytheism, monotheism. These are the categories of a theology that came out of the West. Okay? Now, we have to think about what are the ways in which we then thought about our gods and what are the kinds of hierarchies that really developed. And the Puranic literature is a very interesting literature there, because if you think about the Puranas, you can broadly put them into, I would say, into three categories. Right? You can speak about the Shaivite Puranas, you can speak about the Vaishnava Puranas, and you can speak about the Shakto Puranas, the Devi Puranas, where the goddess is, all important. And the Vaishnava ones, Vishnu is all important, and the Shaivite ones, Shiva is all important. But it's not the case that the Shaivite Puranas, and why do we have so many of these gods, right? The fact that we have so many of these gods, I'll get back to the Puranas in just a minute, that we are speaking about multiple gods, and much in the way in which the Greeks had many different gods. Right? Now, that is because you have to think of the world of mythos there. Okay, this is where the word myth, by the way, has become a very big problem in the English language, because the word myth today has simply been reduced to falsehood. Yeah, if someone says something and someone says, "Oh, I heard such and such," and you say, "Oh, it's a myth," meaning there's no veracity to it. It's completely false. It's not verifiable. This is a very impoverished use of the word myth. When we speak about Greek mythology or Hindu mythology, what we're really speaking about is a way of comprehending the world, and particularly a way of comprehending the relationship between the gods and humans, because the gods and the humans are on a continuum. They're on a continuum. A god can, through certain ways, descend into becoming an asura through acts that are not proper, and then even descend to becoming a human. And a human can rise, so to speak. That's why Emerson said, the American transcendentalist philosopher, man, and I'm quoting him exactly, man is a god in ruins. How interesting, right? Now, you see, the fundamental issue then, therefore, is simply this, that if you look at the Puranic literature, so you will see that the Shaivite Puranas, it's not that they don't have any space for Vishnu, but Vishnu is subsidiary. He's secondary. The Vaishnava Puranas will elevate Vishnu and the avatars of Vishnu, but it's not that they don't have any place for Shaivism. They do. Shiva is secondary there. That's how this world works. And how do you describe this world? You cannot describe it through monotheism, which is what they wanted to do. That's what they wanted to do. And you see, this project in a way goes back. This project of saying that, look, Hinduism should really be viewed as a monotheistic religion, because the reason why they wanted to goes back to the early 19th century. It goes back, guess to whom? Ram Mohan Roy. It goes back to him, because he was the first Indian who really began to use the template of Christianity, particularly the template of Protestant Christianity, to begin to reshape the Hindu worldview. Right? And I think that is going back to the question that you had asked, Rijul. So I've addressed the gist of it. The several first is to place it within a wider politics of what we think about minorities and so on. And I should add as a little footnote that actually even the language of majority and minority is a relatively recent language. India is a civilization. Let's go back to the first question, civilization. One of the things of being a civilization is you don't think through the language of majority and minority. When you begin to think through that, you have definitely become a nation state, albeit, as in the case of India, still an incomplete nation state, because that is the whole project of the Hindutva project, is to make us into a complete, proper nation state. You see, right? Okay. Majority and minority is a certain kind of political arithmetic. And now, of course, it's inescapably a part of who we are all over the world, because electoral politics has a inextricable relationship with minority and majority. You know, the whole question of vote banks, drawing upon certain minorities to support your case, to vote for you, you know, pitting one group against another. This is all part of a certain kind of political arithmetic that has now become part of the common sense of our culture. Okay, and I introduced that phrase common sense here deliberately because one of the ways in which I think we should think about what we do is we need to think about how certain things become part of the common sense of a culture. You see, and that is very important because when they become part of the common sense of a culture, they are no longer questioned. And it is slowly what Hindutva is doing. I'm going to give you a very different language to describe the project of Hindutva. Hindutva is trying to create a different common sense for our culture. I don't believe anyone has ever put it in that framework. That's a framework I would suggest to you. I've suggested others when we were speaking about decolonization. It's trying to create a new common sense for our culture. That common sense means certain things that become part of that common sense of our culture are no longer questioned. In the way in which, let me give you a very pedestrian example having nothing to do with Hinduism, and then I come back to that. Okay. So, for example, when someone says, and you must be hearing that phrase every day, oh, we have to think outside the box. You know, I always tell them anyone who uses that phrase, don't expect anything from them. Don't expect anything from anyone who uses that phrase because now it becomes part of the common sense of our culture. Think outside the box. What does that mean? When we start to rehearse cliches all the time, right, there's going to be a difficulty. There's going to be a real difficulty. Or someone says, this is not rocket science. Why? So what's so difficult about rocket science? Or what's so interesting about rocket science? First, somebody has to explain that to me. You know, it's like we should all pay our veneration to rocket science because it's some very esoteric field. I mean, what are rocket scientists doing anyhow? Just helping to destroy the world, as far as I can tell. They haven't done anything singularly good for humanity. So why anybody in his right mind should ever want to use that expression to suggest, oh, somebody belongs to an elevated sphere? Yeah, elevated sphere of destruction, if you ask me, right? See, this becomes part of the common sense of our culture. We think, there's this field, and my God, this is the summation of knowledge. You know, this is not rocket science. I hear this every day. Somebody will say something, and you say, यार इसको समझ नहीं आ रही है. अरे rocket science तो नहीं है यार. समझ क्यों नहीं आ रही है तुझे? Right? That's the expression. Now, thinking through history, transforming our understanding of Hinduism so it becomes a religion of history, not a mythos. This is becoming part of the common sense of what it means to be a Hindu. Okay? And I think this is something we have to be really wary of. We have to really question that, probe that, and not let anyone get away with that. And we'll have to think of all the different ways in which certain things become part of the common sense of our culture. And you can take examples from across the board in all spheres of life, you know, where things become part of the common sense of our culture. You take, I, as a matter of principle, okay, student, I've taught at 31 years for the same institution. So you can imagine I've had lots of students I've taught. And some of the undergraduates come to me, the ones who have done very well, and say, Professor Lal, I'm going to be applying to Harvard or Pennsylvania, UPenn, or whatever. And I took 2 classes with you and I got an A in both of them. And may I ask you for a letter of recommendation? And I say, so what is the letter of recommendation uh, you want? In other words, what are you going to study? And they say, I want to do MBA. And I tell them flatly, I don't write letters for anyone who wants to do MBA, because business administrations, business schools shouldn't exist in my view. Okay, they're not part of my worldview. I think they're illegitimate enterprises, and I say, I'm sorry, I simply can't write for you. I have nothing against you, but I simply do not write letters for people who do business. And many of these are Indian students and they're Gujaratis. And I tell them, let me tell you a little bit. Your forefathers ran all over the world. Okay, for 1,000 years there were Gujaratis all over the Indian Ocean world. There are lots of historical works that testify to that. They did, and they did fantastically well. Okay, and they never went to any business school, I can assure you. I tell them, and of course they say to me, the common rejoinder, yeah, but the business is a lot more complicated now. Yes, it's a lot more complicated, but it's like the mathematicians. The best mathematicians still use a paper and pencil. you know and tell them, you need to just rethink what this whole idea of doing business and doing it well is. Okay, I just want you to. So I tell them, if you're seriously interested, read these 5 books and come back to me after 2 months and we'll have a discussion. And then I may consider it. And of course, they never come back. No one has ever come back. Where I tell them, read these books about business history or about the categories of knowledge, or etc., etc. Because you see, what is it now? It's part of the common sense of the culture that if you want to succeed in business, even if you come from a business minded family which has been doing very good business for 300 years, like the Marwaris, for example, they had a whole system, right? Even if you come from that, you still want to go and do an MBA now at Harvard, because you think that being credentialed at Harvard is going to do everything for you. And then I tell them that, you have ever heard of the Dibbawalas in Mumbai, because Harvard Business School uses that as a case study. There are millions of these lunch boxes that are delivered, right, by the Tiffinwalas in Bombay. They don't use any computers, nothing. It's just a color coding system. And I tell them Harvard uses that as a case study, right? But of course, it's part of the common sense of our cultures to also think of so-called world-class universities. What does Ashoka University in this country want to do? It just wants to become another mini Harvard. It's pathetic, frankly, completely pathetic, if you ask me. You know, and this is all part of being colonized. So we are now back to all the questions we have talked about: civilization, decolonization, doing history, right?
So, do you have time for one quick concluding question?
Okay, let's one last question, and I'll see if I can keep the answer very short. Yeah.
So just since you have had a very interesting educational trajectory, whether or your training as a social scientist, so I mean, as one part of it is any quick advice for aspiring historians and aspiring social scientists. And since you covered what's been happening at Columbia, a few quick reflections on student activism, before we call it a day.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, so I'm at UCLA, as you know, and on the East Coast, Columbia University was the epicenter of the, if one wants to speak of an epicenter, I mean, very casually, informally, because the student protests have really been throughout the country. in the US, right? I mean, there were over 250 universities where encampments were set up. Um, by the way, also encampment, what is this word encampment? Nobody ever heard of it before. This, and now everybody is using it as they always knew what it was. It's always been a part of the dictionary. So again, these are very interesting ways in which how things get normalized. Okay, but let's leave that aside for a moment. So on the East Coast, it was Columbia. On the West Coast, it was my university, UCLA. Right. So I know exactly what happened, and I wrote a document which can be found on my blog, vinaylal.wordpress.com. I wrote an open letter to Chancellor of the university, a very strongly worded open letter, uh, where I condemned, among other things, the university action, because my university was the site of perhaps some of the worst violence that took place on university campuses. Now, I'm going to have to be very brief because I have lots of thoughts about dissent, student unrest. I know the history of that, uh, not only the contemporary history, I know the history going back to the 1960s. And I wrote an article in Open Magazine about what happened at Jamia and JNU as well, 3.5, 4 years ago. So I've been keeping abreast of that, and I know the history of that in India as well. So I'll be very brief because it's possible to introduce lots of nuances, but the gist of it is this. And then I'll go back to the first part about any words of advice for young historians and so on. That there are certain problems certainly in the student uh, movement. There's no question about it. However, these are not the problems that the opponents have pointed out. The opponents suggest that these are forms of anti-Semitism. I strongly object to that and repudiate that. And I know certainly firsthand from what happened at UCLA, where at least two students I know who were in my class got arrested. Um, uh, and I know from speaking to lots of the students and going to some of the demonstrations and going to the university, the night the police came, they cleared it at 1:40 using extreme violence. It was horrifying, absolutely horrifying to think that this university campus had been transformed into a garrison state. And American police is not like the English Bobby. I mean, these people have been issued weapons that the military uses, because that's one of the things that happened in the United States over the last 20 years. Military grade weapons are handed down to the police departments. These people are very heavily armed. You had 200 of these armed. You would think that you were really in a war zone. I mean, God's sake, it's just some students who are protesting what's happening in Gaza. Right? And this is the university reaction to it. And to say that these students were animated by anti-Semitism is completely false, completely false. It should be completely repudiated. One of the most astonishing things about these student protests, and I'm greatly encouraged by that, is to see the revival of student activity, because I myself have often thought that, yeah, look, universities are no longer sites of learning, unfortunately. All that the students want to do is come there, get a degree, and get a job. What does education have to do with getting a job? Ideally, it should be simply to just come to the university and to flourish intellectually, to grow. But at least now the students were animated, and what is so interesting is that it was the greatest mix of students you could think of. Lots of the people who are going to read this, or will be in India, should be heartened to know South Asians were well represented in all the student protests all over the United States. If you listen to the interviews, you'd find so many of the students who were involved and who were the spokesperson were South Asians, and not necessarily Muslims. That's the interesting thing. So you're talking not just about Palestinian and Arabs and Muslims who were taking part, and you're talking about white people and South Asians and Chinese and Jewish students, significant number of Jewish students. So I think this should be underscored, and I hope the students in India will take a leaf out of that, at least in this respect, because as I said, I'm always a little wary about, taking examples from there and just simply transplanting them over here. But I think that there, and of course I know what happened here. I went to the Shaheen Bagh. Of course, that was not student led initially. There were the women of Shaheen Bagh, but we know that it's intertwined with a number of other circumstances. And women who came out of Shaheen Bagh, in fact, came out because of the violence that had been committed against the students at Jamia. All right. So it's all intertwined there, and so I know that the students played a role here. And in that sense, they don't need to learn really anything from what happened there in the US. But I think rather the best way to put it is I think we have to think about the, the particular cross sections here. We have to think about the intersections. We have to think about the ways in which we can develop these movements together. Okay. So the gist of it is that I think that the student movements in the US, the student unrest, I think it's been very encouraging. I think largely it's been inspired by sentiments that I think are correct. A feeling of injustice being committed against people in Gaza. Whether the objectives they stipulate, divestment, etc., whether these can be met, whether the students adhere to the highest standards of nonviolence, that's questionable. But they're students; they're still learning, and it's not as though nonviolence can be understood in a very rigid way. Uh, that when you're in the flow of things of this kind, things take their own course. Okay, so as I said, there may be some issues, but on balance, there is no question whatsoever that what happened there in the United States, and then to some extent in other countries, a few other countries, particularly in Europe, I think is very encouraging. Going back to the first part of your question, I don't know if I'm in the position to give really any advice to anyone as such. Okay, that is that I speak my thoughts, I speak my mind. I have a certain way of thinking about the world, but I would say a few things. Okay, not by way of how do you achieve, because I get several emails every day from somebody in India. Sir, how do I join the IAS? I've heard your lectures, or I've seen your lectures, or this or that. Sir, how can I prepare well for exams? Well, read the Prime Minister's book, Exam Warriors. How to prepare for exams, get a good night's sleep, make sure you have sharpened pencils, and you've done a few yoga asanas. If you've ever read that book, it's comical actually. Exam Warriors. I mean, it's written really for a 5-year-old. Contrast that with what a former prime minister wrote, a book called The Discovery of India. Okay, and you'll see the contrast. But on a more serious note, I would say first, have or develop a kind of an intellectual curiosity. You know, be capacious in your reading. College, particularly, as a time, and Indian colleges, unfortunately, they're much more restrictive. What you can do. The syllabus is set more or less. In the US, it's very different. There's so many electives. You know, Here it's much more difficult. But even here, because you know, a college education is not only what you learn in the class. You know, it's going to the dhaba. Okay, the Ganga dhaba at JNU has been famous for all kinds of reasons. It's the conviviality, the collegiality, the conversations, the animated life. This is part of what it means to be college, and that gets enhanced if you're a person of capacious interests and you read widely. And please, reading widely doesn't mean spending 2 hours on WhatsApp. I mean, that's not reading. uh, you know in fact, this device should be thrown out for for a good part of the day. Should just be thrown out. Keep it away, because it's very difficult to get serious reading done when this is around you all the time. Okay, um, so I'd say first, be a person of wide intellectual curiosity. Don't think of instrumentalizing your learning all the time. It need not lead to a job, it need not lead to an outcome. Okay. Number two, learn to live with ambiguity. I think this is very important. Ambiguity. That is that, there are many ways to understand that too. Okay. One of the ways to understand is what I've already hinted at, if, in my remarks before, namely that, there is this many sidedness to reality, there are many different perspectives. And one should not be convinced that one's own position encompasses the entire truth. That is almost never the case. Almost never the case. There's something in the other position. I might, in my conversations, say, oh, this is absurd or something, but notice how I said, okay, look at the Hindu education founded. Let's say they had used a different language, because then we try to find a common ground. You have to try to find that common ground, because otherwise you're living in a world where there's animosity all the time. But it's not simply to make life more comfortable. That's not the point of this. The point of it is that that it's very difficult to think of any single point of view that can be encompassed in its totality. So in the present conflict, over Gaza, I have very strong views. I've written 3 odd pieces for the Indian Express. I think I have a new one coming out in a couple of days. I sent it to them a couple of days that they had asked me to. And, my views of Israel are becoming more and more uh, uh, rigid. And I worry about that too, a little bit too. But they're becoming a little more rigid because of what's happening, the scale of it. I think Israel is impervious to anything or to anyone. Uh, you know, but nevertheless, I know that obviously there are some uh, things within Israel that one can look forward to. So if one thought there was nothing there, for example, the best source, I can assure you, the best source, not just for information, but for analysis and criticism of what Israel is doing, is still coming from Israel. It's coming from the Haaretz newspaper, which is their a newspaper that comes out. And you read what Gideon Levy, who's an Israeli, who lives in Israel, who's been an editor of the Haaretz for a while. I mean, no one can be as critical as he has been of what Israel has done. You know, so there is at least some self-reflexivity in some of the people there. You see, right? And that can become the common ground for thinking about. If you were thinking about, oh yeah, Israel, I don't want to think about this. This place should be, completely out of my horizon. It shouldn't exist. If somebody took that view, which some people do, right? Well, I think we need to check ourselves. Okay. So when I speak of ambiguity, I'm not speaking about, I'm speaking of a certain kind of ambiguity where we realizes that there are gray areas, and let's revel in these gray areas. Let's enjoy them, because that's what makes life interesting, intellectually, ethically. What is the question in the Mahabharata, right? What is dharma? Dharma is a very slippery thing, very slippery. How do you know exactly, right, what is the right thing to do at a certain point in time? Okay? So my thing is, for I try to tell my students, be a person of wide intellectual interest, be capacious in your thinking, okay? Entertain some degree of ambiguity about things, okay? And third, which is related to the second, but I put it in, is question the common sense of the culture. Question what has taken for granted always. Okay. These are the ways in which one begins to interrogate things and begins to live, I think, a richer intellectual and ethical and political life. So that's what I would really say. I never really give them advice as such. I mean, except when my own PhD student is on says, well, how do I position myself in the job market? Obviously, then I'll tell them something about how they're going to position themselves, how they're going to prepare for the interview, right? But your question is as a more generic level. What would I say to an aspiring student who's interested in, uh, you know, uh, thinking about a life in the academy, uh, life as an intellectual? And by the way, the life in the academy is not really the life of an intellectual for the most part, because most people end up doing very pedestrian things very often. So a public intellectual and a scholar and an academic, there's some overlap, and then in some ways these are all quite discrete things. Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir, for that insightful answer. This interview has almost reached 2 hours now,
Yeah.
almost 30 minutes beyond the 90 minutes mark,
Yeah.
but it was a very fulfilling conversation. It would be great to have you back sometime
Sure.
for another
Sure.
topic.
It'd be my pleasure. Yeah. And I do request that that before you print it, please share it with me in
Huh.
case there are any corrections or anything. Yeah. Right. um, uh, so that will be nice, and I'll be happy to speak to you maybe one of these days on Palestine.
Hmm.
uh, Gandhi. I recommend, by the way, to everyone, if you've never read it, a piece that Gandhi wrote. It's simply called The Jews. It's published in the collected works of Mahatma Gandhi. You can find it on the internet. 26th November 1938. Nothing as insightful as that has ever been written, in my view. Astonishingly. And this by a person who had never gone to Palestine. He'd gone to Egypt, he had stopped in Egypt, um, and who was far removed from what was happening because, of course, by this time, the last time he had left India was when he had gone for the Roundtable Conference, right? Um, and that was several years ago. And this is 1938. And, that was his last overseas trip when it when he had gone for the Roundtable Conference. And uh, after that, he never left India. But there are a few scholars, Norman Finkelstein being one of them, a Jewish scholar, who actually wrote a little book on Gandhi. I think he's now taken a harder view. I think more recently in view of what's been happening in Gaza now, I think he's not so firmly persuaded that nonviolence and Gandhi's ideas, uh, you know, uh, should be tried out. But certainly, uh, some years ago, he wrote that book, uh, uh, you know, uh, which is basically Gandhi's writings on the Jews and on the Jewish question, uh, where he took the view that Gandhi was extraordinarily insightful. But in any case, whatever Finkelstein thinks, my own view is that what he wrote on 26 January, published on 26 January 19, November, sorry, 26 November 1938, I think is still the most extraordinary document, about thinking about a Jewish homeland, you know, who does Palestine belong to, etc. Yeah. All right, gentlemen, thank you very much for inviting me.